welcome back to another Last Wraps from the Archives video, episode number 4. And our first 3 episodes, we were doing the 1980 Top Superstar cards, and today we're going to continue on with the cards. As I mentioned, I didn't have a complete set of these things, but I really like these things. They're 40 years old now, and I thought they were pretty cool. So we're going to carry on and tell some stories about some of the other cards that we have. So first up today, I'm going to take a look at former Detroit Tiger outfielder Steve Kemp. And Steve Kemp was drafted in the first round and first overall by the Tigers in the 1976 Major League Baseball player draft. And I guess why this is kind of significant is this week, Spencer Torkelson was drafted by the Tigers first overall in this year's draft. So Kemp was the last Tiger hitter selected first overall. The Tigers have taken a couple of pitchers, Casey Mize and Matt Anderson, with recent number 1 overall picks, but first hitter that Detroit selected since Spencer Torkelson. Well, Kemp went to USC and played for legendary coach Rod Detto. He actually made the Trojans as a walk-on player, and I always think it's pretty impressive when you've got a first-year player at a 4-year school that could come in and make it as a walk-on. That's pretty cool. And he distinguished himself as a guy who hustled and worked hard. And, of course, at that time, USC had a powerhouse. They'd won 5 national championships in a row, and Kemp was part of the last two teams there. So he was teammates with Rich Dower and Roy Smalley and Fred Lynn. So Kemp's best year as a ball player was 1979 when he was an all-star for the Tigers. He had hit 26 homers and knocked in 105 runs while batting .318. But after the 1981 season, he was traded straight up to the Chicago White Sox for Chet Lemon, who went on to become a big part of the '84 World Series team. And, of course, at that time, the Tigers played in the American League East, and the White Sox played in the American League West. And so, it wasn't like today where they're both those teams are in the Central Division, so they only saw each other a couple times a year at home and away. Anyways, interesting story about Kemp came up recently in the Detroit Free Press, and it kind of changed some of the thoughts that I had with regards to not just to Kemp, but how it sort of the trade went down. So Jim Campbell, who was the general manager of the Tigers at that time, and I mentioned in one of the other videos that we did about Jack Morris and about Jack Morris telling the story that pitchers like him were dime a dozen, and they could. So Morris reached in his pocket, said, "Here's a dime, go get yourself a dozen, but you're not going to get me." But Steve Kemp said he never got off to a good start with Jim Campbell. He said that Campbell came to his house to sign him to his first contract, and Kemp didn't have an agent. But Kemp says, "I knew what number 1 picks got paid, and basically the Tigers and Campbell didn't want to pay him." And of course, growing up in that area, Jim Campbell had a reputation of being a bit of a skinflint. He was cheap. He didn't want to pay, and the Tigers at that time, under their ownership, didn't want to pay. And so he says, "I insisted on a major league contract, and because he wanted the option of free agency after 3 years." And so Campbell finally gave in, and he didn't like that. So then later on, Kemp in his career ended up winning 2 arbitration awards against the Tigers, and Campbell wasn't pleased. And Campbell told the media that it was because of Steve Kemp he was going to have to cut secretary salaries and raise ticket prices. I mean, if you can't afford to pay your secretaries, what are you doing playing baseball? Anyways, the thing that Kemp said that he was ticked off about is he didn't find out from Campbell or Sparky Anderson. It was former Detroit Free Press writer Joe LaPointe told him he'd been traded to Chicago. And he said, "Sparky never called me to this day," and he goes, "I feel frustrated and hurt by that." And Campbell told the press that he'd lost bat speed, but Charlie Lau, who was his hitting coach in Chicago, sure didn't think so. And that was Steve Kemp. And he went on to play with a couple other teams after that. He spent time with the Yankees and with the Pirates, and but former number 1 pick overall, and Detroit Tiger, Steve Kemp. Second player that we're going to talk about today spent 17 seasons in the major leagues, and most of his career was spent in Houston before he went to Cincy and finished up with St. Louis and the Dodgers. And that was Cesar Cedeno. And Cedeno was a 4-time All-Star and a 5-time Gold Glove winner. As a matter of fact, in Cedeno's career, he stole more than 50 bases 6 times and was a career 285 hitter. But the interesting thing, I grew up in an area that we were American League, not just fans, but you didn't see the National League teams too much, so you didn't get to know their players until maybe the All-Star Game or the World Series. And following Cleveland, Detroit, Toronto in that area, knowing those three cities were fairly close. I didn't know a whole lot about certain guys. So Cedeno had an interesting story in his career, and so it was in the off season of 1973. He was involved in an incident in the Dominican Republic in which a gun was discharged in a motel room, killing a 19-year-old woman who was in the room with him. And some people would report that this girl was his mistress. Well, the two were drinking and playing with a gun, and the gun accidentally went off, and the girl was killed, as the report alleges. And Cedeno eventually turned himself in and was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and then released after spending 20 days in jail. But it was voluntary manslaughter first, and then it was reduced to involuntary manslaughter. And he was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and fined $100. And I think about that, and I say, how life is valued sometimes in certain places in the world, or how little life is valued. That $100, even in that time, even though $100 was good money, that's basically what it was that afforded him his release. But really, it was from that moment on that kind of changed Cedeno. He was never the same player. He was never as good at the age of 21 or 22, and there was some popular theory that they figured that Cedeno was never able to process or able to deal with that death. And he certainly took a lot of abuse from the fans. And in 1981, he had an issue. I think it was in Chicago that he went up into the stands to confront a heckler who was giving it to him, and really, really crazy. Peter Gammons, who used to write for, I think, the Boston Globe and also Sports Illustrated, did a profile on him, and they said he'll always end up with decent stats, but stats were for people who didn't know anything. He was never the same hitter after the incident. That's what a teammate of his had told Peter Gammons. And that's the unfortunate story of Cesar Cedeno, but still went on to have a 17-year big league career. Nobody burst onto the big league scene faster in a career than this guy did, and that would be Vida Blue. And Vida Blue broke into the big leagues with the Oakland A's at the age of 19 in 1969. He was a 6-time All-Star and a league MVP. He was a 3-time World Series champ and captured the Cy Young in 1971. He went on to win 20 games 3 times in his career. In some ways, when I think of Vida Blue, I think of Dontrelle Willis more recently, how fast Dontrelle jumped onto the scene. But the difference was his Blue had a lengthier career where Willis fizzled pretty quickly. If you had these numbers today, he won 209 games and lost 161. I think he'd be in the Hall of Fame. And Bill James from the Baseball Abstract said that Blue was the fastest pitcher in his day, only behind Nolan Ryan, but was the hardest throwing left-hander. And I know that Pete Rose once said it was, if I remember right, that Pete Rose said the by far hardest throwing left-hander he'd ever faced at that point in his career. But Blue is also the answer to a trivia question, and it was funny. I guess he was in the Boston Red Sox booth, and he'd stumped Chris Berman and whoever else was in there with him. And he said that who was the last switch hitter to win the MVP? And everybody was, kind of scratching their head. And of course, that would have been Vida Blue. But I think a better question, this isn't the trivia question that I was going to ask today. But the one question would be is who was the last MVP to have 10 or more sacrifice hits in a season? And I don't know the answer to this, but I'm betting the guy that I'm holding right here is probably the answer to that same question. I think that year he had 13 hits. You think if what MVP is going to be asked to sack bunt throughout the season? I don't know. Not anybody in the modern era. So anyway, so why is Blue not in the Hall of Fame with those numbers and pretty much having a phenomenal career? Well, like Dave Parker, who we featured in a previous video, cocaine addiction derailed the second half of Blue's career, with Blue drawing a 90-day jail sentence, and his name kept coming up in the Pittsburgh drug trials late in his career. Blue was asked about the cocaine use, and he says that, I quote, "that happened in my life that you can't erase, and you have to deal with it and you move forward," and that's unquote. And the other thing I think that plays a factor into this is where he played. For those people who live on the West Coast, and I've been on the West Coast now for going on 13 years, you start to appreciate how the West Coast guys are underappreciated. And I mean it this way, that on the East Coast, you're watching a game at 7 o'clock in the evening, and then by the time the West Coast teams come on, you're going to bed because you got to get up to work the next morning. And on the West Coast, you're watching the East Coast games at 4 in the afternoon, and then you're just getting settled in for that second end of the doubleheader when the West Coast teams take the field at 7 o'clock. You're right there ready to watch. So I think that's the difference, and that's sometimes the West Coast guys don't always get the notoriety or the appreciation that they should get because they're not seen as much or as often, especially during the week. Anyways, that's Wyatt Blue, and that's his story. So the next player that we're going to feature today, we're going to the New York Yankees for the rest of them, and today it is Greg Nettles. And Greg Nettles had an interesting career, but 22-year major league veteran. He was a 6-time All-Star and 2-time Gold Glove winner, but I remember some of his defensive gems from the World Series. That was probably, I think there was a ball smoked down the third base line. He went airborne and dives and makes this catch and makes the play, gets up and fires across the diamond. And as a kid, I remember watching him play in the World Series, and I think it was in the League Championship Series. He was outstanding. Not a Hall of Famer. 22 years in the big leagues, only a .248 career hitter, but smashed 390 career home runs. He began his career with the Twins, and then he went to the Tribe, but I think he made himself with the Yankees, and of course, he ended up going to San Diego after that, and I forget there were a couple other teams. But the thing that was interesting about Nettles, and I'll put some links up top that you guys can go and check out. But he seemed to be the center of controversy a number of times in his career. It seemed to follow him. So the first one was during a game against Boston in 1976. Nettles was on second base, and at the onset of the brawl, he tackled pitcher Bill Lee from behind. And when it appeared the dust had settled and the brawl was over, Lee confronted Nettles for tackling him from behind. And the fracas resumed, and Nettles swung at Lee. More players joined in, and Nettles ended up breaking Lee's collarbone as they went down to the ground in a pile. And despite the incident, ironically, Nettles wasn't suspended, and he went on to lead the American League with 32 homers. So pretty crazy, you get, brawls these days, guys get suspended and so on and so forth. The second one in 1977, Game 5 of the American League Championship Series, George Brett smokes a ball into the right center field gap, and he goes sliding into third base safe, but it appears that Nettles tries to kick Brett in the head. Well, Brett loses it and absolutely smokes Nettles with a headshot. A brawl ensues, and then Thurman Munson and other players all get involved. But the crazy part about this is nobody gets tossed. You got a full-on brawl going on in Game 5, which is the deciding game of the League Championship Series, and nobody gets tossed. Amazing. So the other part to this is I guess Nettles really held a grudge, and his grudge, of course, was against George Brett. So for those of you who weren't sure, I think that as lore would have it, it was Nettles who tipped Billy Martin off that Brett had too much pine tar on his bat in the later infamous pine tar game. So at least that's how it went. Nettles is the guy who tips off Billy Martin to challenge the home run by Brett, and of course Brett comes flying out of the dugout, and the rest is history. And then the third incident that stood out for me was Nettles was involved in the 1984 famous San Diego Padre Atlanta Brave beanball game. And if I remember right, Eric Shaw of the Padres was in the dugout, shirt off, just looking like a crazy man. But it was a Braves home game in August '84, and Nettles charged the mound and attempted to tackle Braves relief pitcher Donnie Moore after Moore had beaned Nettles, and Nettles missed and then was thrown to the ground by Braves first baseman, a longtime Yankee teammate Chris Chambliss. But I think I've got links to this video as well that I'll be able to attach in the top, and when you're done watching this, you can go over and check that out. Absolutely incredible stuff. Anyways, Greg Nettles, great baseball player, but also center of controversy on a lot of other events. A couple of things I wanted to squeeze in that I didn't do in the video. I got a little piece here. I don't know where this is from, but kind of neat. It's see if I can get it into focus, and that would be a Craig Nettles button. I don't know where I got this or where it was produced or how I came about it. It's been sitting in my shelf here for a long time, but Greg Nettles. And then on the back, it shows, he was third base and his .228 batting average, and it looks like it was number 66 of 133, Fun Foods, and I don't know, I think that's what it is, Fun Foods, but I don't know who they are. But yeah, that's the back. It's the Craig Nettles, Greg Nettles button. If I can get back into focus again. Where are you, Greg? There you are. Beautiful. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was the autographed baseball in the background today. And in the last video, we talked about the unfortunate situation that Dave Parker's in. And this guy who's autographed this ball is in the exact same situation. And of course, the hero of the World Series for the Dodgers back in the late 80s. And that would be Kirk Gibson. Kirk Gibson autographed baseball. Gibby, unfortunately, also suffering from Parkinson's disease, was announced a couple of years ago, and he does some games in the Tiger broadcast booth, and when you listen to his voice, it's not the same. It's not the strong kind of Kirk Gibson. I know he's older, but unfortunately, Gibby's health is not where it was. But yeah, that's Kirk Gibson and Greg Nettles. The last guy we're going to look at, some people have statues erected, some people are named after schools or buildings, but this guy is got a surgery named after him, and this would be Tommy John. And Tommy John was he was a pretty good big league pitcher. He was a 4-time All-Star, and ironically, 3 of the times he was All-Star came after his surgery that we'll talk about in a couple minutes here. He was a 3-time 20-game winner, pitched 26 years in the big leagues, 26. He won 288 games, but he didn't get into the Hall of Fame, and I think it was this year that he also, the Veterans Committee looked at it and thought about getting him in, and he didn't receive the votes. I think it was Alan Trammell ended up getting in this year, but not Tommy John. Anyways, he played for Cleveland, the White Sox, the Dodgers, the Yankees, Angels, Oakland, back to the Yanks. But it was in 1974 when he permanently damaged the ulnar collateral ligament in his pitching arm, leading to the obviously the revolutionary surgical procedure, which now bears his name. And the operation basically replaced the ligament in the elbow of his pitching arm with a tendon from his right forearm. Just as a side, there was a guy that played for me a few years ago who had Tommy John. In fact, it was a shortstop of all things, a positional guy. Had Tommy John surgery, and they took the ligament from his hamstring. They took a piece of his hamstring and put it into his elbow. So I don't know how that's changed, but certainly that seems to be the way. Well, Dr. Frank Jobe performed the surgery, and it seemed unlikely if Tommy John would ever be able to pitch again. And the doctor gave John 100-to-1 odds of it being successful. And of course, he missed the entire 1975 season. But John had it anyway, because his other option was to start working as a used car salesman in Terre Haute, Indiana, which was where he was from, at a friend's. So spent the entire 75 season in recovery. And then he worked with teammate and pitcher Mike Marshall, who had a PhD in kinesiology and was known how to help pitchers recover from injuries on learning different grips while pitching. Mike Marshall, just as a side, when he was with the Dodgers and he pitched in over 100 and some odd games one year as a reliever, Marshall, if I'm not mistaken, did his PhD at Michigan State. And he is a pretty interesting character who pretty much a lot of baseball has not given him much credit or much time for. But he's got some interesting thoughts on throwing and pitching and how the ball should be thrown. But a lot of people think Mike Marshall's a quack. Anyway, I shouldn't say that. I think his theories are quacky, but outside of the baseball norm. But what was ironic about John is that when you think of the Tommy John guys today and you think about how hard pitchers throw, Tommy John was not a hard thrower. He was a soft-throwing sinker ball type pitcher who basically induced a lot of ground balls and was able to roll double plays. And at the start of his big league career, he threw a fastball and a curveball, and then it was the Indians who tried to get him to throw a slider, but he struggled with it and ended up just going back to two pitches, being a fastball, curveball guy. And in 72, he added a screwball, which he used as a changeup to complement his repertoire and of pitches. But what the challenge was is his arm lagged behind the rest of his body when he threw pitches, and that's where you see guys that puts a lot of stress on the arm, and that contributed to his UCL injury in 74. But he was a finalist for the modern baseball era in 2020. However, when they announced in December of last year, unfortunately, Tommy John didn't get the nod. It's Tommy John, and former New York Yankee, and of course, the first to have ulnar collateral ligament replacement. Okay, everybody, it's trivia time, and today I'm going to ask a question. I've had a number of videos recently, or the last couple of days, popped up with regards to Japanese baseball, and today the trivia question is going to revolve around Japanese baseball. In 2018, in the fall, Major League Baseball sent a touring team, all-star team, over to Japan to play the Samurai Japan, which is the Japanese national team. And of course, the Japanese national team, as we look at some of these Calbee cards, are pretty cool pieces. You can see a little bit smaller than our regular cards, but kind of neat. But my trivia question is this: Game 3 of the 2018 Japanese American League, or I shouldn't say American League, but the Japanese Major League Baseball tour. The Americans only won one of the 6 games, or I should say the North Americans won only one of the 6 games, because there was a number of star players that went over to play. My question is who was the pitcher who was credited with the win in Game 3 for Major League Baseball's All-Stars? Leave it in the comments section. Let me know who it is, and we'll send out a package. I sent something out this week to our winner from last week, and we'll give a little summary here in the next couple of weeks of who our winners were, and maybe they'll do a video to show us what we sent out. Anyways, listen, thanks everybody again for watching, and this has been another Last Raps Baseball video production. Have a great day.